Dr. Aaron Hershkowitz is the manager of the Krateros Project, an initiative to digitize the collection of epigraphic squeezes, paper negatives of inscribed texts, at the Institute for Advanced Study. Dr. Hershkowitz received his PhD from Classics from Rutgers in 2018 with a dissertation centered on democratic politicians in classical Athens. This is where I know Dr. Hershkowitz from. His work on inscriptions goes back over a decade and was recognized in 2014-15 with a Fulbright Fellowship to study at the American School of Classical Studies and the Epigraphical Museum in Athens, Greece. Dr. Hershkowitz is a strong presence in the digital ancient world community, serving as the steering committee member for epigraphy.info and the Herodotus helpline. And he has a good knowledge of Greek food as well, and a cookbook out on, what was it called?
It was Lessons from Loring Hall.
Lessons from Loring Hall. So if you're interested in Greek food, check it out. So please join me in welcoming Dr.
Thank you, Charles. And thank you for the invitation to speak at this really great lecture series in honor of Father Cotter. And my subject today is going to be the Krateros Project, the project that I work on. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we do and where it fits into the landscape of digital scholarship. And I think that's a talk that I hope Father Cotter would have particularly appreciated, given that he actually had a history in digital scholarship as well. So one of the big projects for which he's known is something that had to do with the roots of the English language that he called a hypertext and was essentially an online book, an online volume dedicated to how the English language evolved from languages like Greek, Latin, and all sorts of intermediaries. So digital scholarship in ancient Mediterranean studies has been going on for a very long time. Really, although you might not expect it, classicists and ancient world scholars have often been early adopters of very modern technology. So here's a little roadmap of what I'm going to talk to you about. I want this talk to be accessible to folks at any level of ancient world studies, of familiarity with technology. So I'm going to try to aim it broadly. I will probably miss at some point, so I apologize if I jump in too far. And for some of you, some things will probably be review. So I apologize if it's stuff that you've already heard before. When we get to the questions and answers, I am very happy to take questions at any level. So it can be super technical stuff, or it can be very basic stuff. There's no bad questions in this area. So we'll start with that. I'll talk a little bit about the digitization that we do at the Krateros Project and where that fits into the broader landscape of digitization in ancient world studies. And I'll talk about machine learning, which has a place kind of as the future of where our project is going, and which has some really exciting applications for studies of a variety of fields, textual, archaeological, and otherwise in the ancient Mediterranean world. And I'll kind of finish along those lines with some discussion of where these kinds of tools and techniques and projects play in both to the classroom, where you're learning or teaching about the ancient Mediterranean world, and to student-led research, because research is not just a thing for people who have finished their PhD in a subject. It's something that students can participate in and can drive as well. And I think digital research is a place that is particularly apt for that for a variety of reasons that I'll go into here. So we'll start with this overview, and we'll start with epigraphy, which is a word that I may have thrown out once or twice here, and certainly Charles mentioned, comes from the Greek epi plus graphein, so it's to write on, and epigraphy is the study of things written on other things, right? So it can be written on anything. We may think of it in terms of marble inscriptions. So you can see me with a ruler and an inscription here that's on stone. And certainly a lot of the surviving inscriptions are on stone. It's a fairly durable material. And also, it's not as inherently valuable as some metals are. So gold is close to as durable as marble is, but people like gold. And so if you carve something on gold, chances are pretty good someone else is going to grab it and use it for their own purposes at some point or other, right? 2,500 years is a long time for someone to ignore a piece of gold. So a lot of what survives does so on objects like marble plinths. And epigraphy kind of stands at this intersection of a lot of different subjects in what we know as classics, right? This really broad umbrella for a subject. Archaeology is incredibly important because most of these objects, everything that you see in this picture here, probably except for me and this table, was pulled out of the ground at an archaeological excavation. So the starting point for pretty much all epigraphy is archaeology. And going back any distance of time, pretty much all of the epigraphists, professional epigraphists you'll run into, are also archaeologists. So my boss, for example, excavates in both Greece and Turkey. His main thing is epigraphy, but he's also an archaeologist. And then once you've got the materials out of the ground, you get the twin subjects of paleography and philology, right? So paleography is the study of letters, of letter forms, of scripts. Well, this is text, it's written objects, so assessing the letters is very important. What shape the letters take can tell you a lot about what era, what time period an inscription came from, which may not be detectable based on anything that's actually written in there. We do have some inscriptions that are dated, that say inside them essentially for us what the exact year is. But a lot of them don't say that, and so the best way that you can tell is by looking at how the letters look, right? And that falls into that heading of paleography. Philology, the study of words, these are texts. And so philology is obviously going to apply when we think about what their word choice is. Is it a verse inscription? Is it poetry? Is it prose? What's being written here? And then when we marshal all of those together, they're incredibly important for history, because they contain a lot of information and details for our understanding of Greek and Roman society that we don't get from our literary sources, from our historians or our epic poets or anything like that. So I mentioned on here the epigraphic habit. The epigraphic habit is kind of this big term that asks the question or attempts to answer the question of why, right? If you think about inscriptions in the modern era, and I asked you, where do you think you could go to find a lot of texts that are written down in stone? What guess would any of you have? Where would you go to find things, words carved into stone in large numbers? A grave, right? A cemetery. If you go to a graveyard or a cemetery, you're going to find hundreds, thousands, hundreds of thousands, depending on how big the cemetery is, of stones with some names on them, some dates, maybe some words, some brief words, maybe a small poem, right? And this was true in the ancient world as well. There were also a lot of funerary inscriptions in the ancient world that similarly ranged from being just a name all the way up to a 20-line poem about the person. But the ancients also inscribed a lot of other stuff that we wouldn't really think about inscribing. They inscribed things that we would consider tax documents. They inscribed the contents of a building. They inscribed how much it cost to build the building and who was paid for building the building, which pieces of the building, right? And so the question, the epigraphic habit attempts to answer this question of, well, why the heck did they do this? Why did they take these documents and carve them into stone and set them up somewhere? And this is a bit of a bait and switch because I'm not going to answer this question for you. And that's because it's an open question. There isn't an answer to why the Greeks, the Romans, carved these texts into stone. People have some theories about it, but it's a constantly changing landscape. So this is a spot where if you get into this, you could have the answer. Right? This is not an answer that's been figured out and set for 100 years. This is something that every year you get a new article thinking about why this is and bringing new ideas into it. So like I said, epigraphy holds some critical information for understanding the history of the Mediterranean and especially the cultures of the Mediterranean. And the reason for that is that it often preserves information that's not preserved elsewhere. So for example, we get a lot of information about people and pets that we don't get from our big narrative histories. right? Which are more interested in kind of the main figures. So you'll pick your list of 5 people, Thucydides and Themistocles and these other big names, Caesar. Well, those are great, but as we know, there were millions of other people wandering around in the ancient world, and it doesn't really do justice to our understanding of Greece or Rome if the only people that we're thinking about are those super huge big name people. So when we look at gravestones, when we look at these smaller inscriptions, things that have a little contract for renting a shop between 2 people, it gives us a lot more information about the lived experience of smaller, as it were, people, normal Athenians, normal Romans, that we don't get from those other sources nearly as much. Pets the same way. We have gravestones in antiquity to pets. There's a very famous one for a pig. It's called the Pig Stele of Edessa, about a pig who traveled all over the Greek world and was a great, magnificent pig, and then unfortunately got hit by a wagon. And there's even a little carving on this stone of like the pig standing in front of horses and a wagon, and then the pig under the wagon. And it's got a little poem about how great the pig is. So just like we love our pets now, they loved their pets in antiquity, and it can come through here in a way we don't see elsewhere. We also get a lot of information about religion from these sources. So we have things like curse tablets. When someone gets angry because their neighbor stole their goat and they have no way to deal with it, well, they could appeal to spirits or gods to try to get revenge on this person. And they would take a tablet of lead and write, "Oh, please torture John, he stole my goat and I really hate him," right? And you fold up the lead and you throw it in a well and you hope that a spirit comes by and does something awful to John. So we have curse tablets. There were oracles in the ancient world. You wanted to know what was going to happen, what you should do in any situation, what had happened. Did John steal my goat? Right? You would ask an oracle and the oracle would give you an answer, often written down on a piece of metal or piece of stone. We also get more large-scale objects like religious laws or calendars, right? So, for instance, you're going to go into a sanctuary. You might see this big stone in front of the sanctuary that says, you cannot enter the sanctuary if you have eaten garlic in the last 15 days, had any kind of sexual intercourse in the last 15 days, killed someone in the last year, right? Good things to know if you're going to try to go in here so you don't offend the gods. And similarly, calendars. Before we had the 5-day work week where we think of, oh, we've got regular work days and weekends, there were festival days and non-festival days that were a lot more random. And so it was really helpful to have a gigantic calendar that you could look at and see what your major festival days were from day to day. The other great thing that we get in inscriptions is information from narrators of the sorts that we don't see as much in other texts. So women, slaves, people who don't have as much of a voice in our literary texts have a quite noticeable voice in the epigraphic record. And so again, it can give us a better understanding of the ancient world, one that's not as biased as the sources that we have through literature are. Okay, so we know what inscriptions are, but what is a squeeze? And the answer is, a squeeze is this. A squeeze is what this gentleman is making right here. And so I'm actually going to pass these squeezes around so y'all can get a chance to handle a squeeze and see what a squeeze is like. You're welcome. And basically, these squeezes are acid-free filter paper. So they're paper that is used by chemists and on the Greek side used to be used to filter beer. And the important thing about filter paper is that it's acid-free. So that means it's not going to disintegrate as quickly as more acidic papers are. If you think of some of those kind of mid-1900s books that all look brown and are kind of disintegrating when you hold them, those were printed on relatively low quality paper, very acidic paper, so it falls apart. These are on good paper, and it's got high wet strength. So it's not like, you know, a tissue or something where you get it wet and it just disintegrates in your hand, which is really important because the way that you make a squeeze, which is what Professor Stephen Tracy is doing here, is you get the paper wet, you put it on a stone, and then you take a brush like this one and you hit it. You hit it a bunch of times until the paper goes into all the little crevices. And then when it dries, you peel it off, and it basically has a paper negative of what you had on the stone surface. And they may kind of look, or you may think because they're cultural objects that they're vulnerable, and they're not particularly vulnerable. You don't need to wear gloves when you're handling them. You're unlikely to do significant damage to them. The reason that one has a little tear is because I shoved it into my backpack. So they're relatively hardy. These are not super valuable squeezes from 100 years ago from our collection. These are squeezes that we made at this squeeze making workshop at Princeton University. And so really the things that they're most vulnerable to are fire, so please don't light them on fire, and water, because when you get them wet, they lose their shape, and that's how you get the shape in the first place. But if you get them wet again, they'll lose their shape again. So that's the thing that they're most vulnerable to. What do we do with the squeeze? Why do we make these things, right? The answer to why we make these things is because they record the face of an inscription, right? Obviously, they don't get the sides very well, but they get the face in its full three-dimensionality. You can feel them when you're passing them around at a particular moment in time, which is important because it provides some insurance against the destruction or deterioration of the stone. So for example, we have some squeezes in our collection at the Institute that are from Macedonia, from northern Greece, that were made in the late 20s and early 30s. And in the late 30s and early 40s, the Italians and the Germans invaded Greece through the north, and during that period, most of the heaviest fighting and bombing was in northern Greece. So there are almost certainly a variety of squeezes in our collection that are of stones that no longer exist anymore, because stone is durable, but not so much against bombs. And we'll actually see later another stone that was digitized that's also in a place that is at the moment in a lot of danger. So it provides some preservation against the destruction or deterioration of the stone. It also allows you to inspect that surface of the stone in multiple places at once. So we had preservation, and now we have accessibility. Most of the stones that are in our collection that you'll see various squeezes of and images of are in Greece or Turkey. And to get over and see the stones themselves, you need to have enough money to buy a plane ticket to get over to Greece or Turkey. You need to have the time off to go spend some time in Greece or Turkey. You need to work with the Greek government or the Turkish government to get permissions to go into the museums and see the various squeezes. You need to see the various stones, right? So there's a limit to who can access them. If you make 5 or 10 squeezes of one of these stones, you can have somebody in China, you can have somebody in the UK, you can have someone here at Seton Hall, you can have someone in California, all essentially looking at the surface of the stone at the same time, right? So it allows a lot more people to work with the stone at the same time. The other two big things are an ease of working with them and the ability to inspect many in short order. So many of you have seen the squeezes that I've passed around, have had a chance to handle them. This is a picture, right? For those who are digital or haven't held one yet. They're relatively small and holdable. We have some huge ones that are harder to work with, but most of them you can kind of grip with a couple of hands, turn it around. It's easy to work with. By contrast, this is the Epigraphic Museum in Athens, me and a colleague. And you can see there are lots of stones. Many of these stones in the background probably weigh upwards of 20 pounds, maybe upwards of 50 pounds. And those are the small ones, because the big ones are these structures here where you have lots of stones immured in concrete and iron. And if you decided, hey, it's going to be a lot easier to see these things if I get some low angle light and it's kind of dark in the background, you don't really have that option. You're not going to be able to move these things. The museum is not going to turn off the lights for you. So you can do what you can do, and you're limited by that. If you have a squeeze, you can take it into a closet, into a dark room. You can shine a flashlight on it from all sorts of different directions. You can hold it up to the sun. Whatever you want to do, you have a lot more flexibility that way. And there are several aspects of study in epigraphy that are more useful if you can do a lot of inscriptions at once. So we talked about paleography, right? If you want to look at the letter forms in a lot of inscriptions, you don't need to spend 30 minutes looking at a given inscription, right? You're not trying to translate it. You're not trying to create a text. You just want to see, what does the alpha look like on this? What does an omega look like on this, right? What you really want to be able to do is look at a lot of these inscriptions and say, okay, I've got all of my inscriptions between 420 and 380 BC. Do they look the same? Do they look different, right? Can I compare them quickly and go back and forth? It's really hard to do that in one of these situations with stones, right? Even if all the stones, you wanted to look at 400 stones, and they were all in the same museum. Usually that's not true. You're going to have to drive. Even if they were all in the same museum, it would still probably take you weeks, if not months, to look at 400 of them. With squeezes, you could look at 400 in a day without too much difficulty, because we just have a big box with a bunch of squeezes, and you turn them over and look at them and keep going, right? So it's a lot easier to work with multiple at the same time. Squeezes. Why does the IAS have a huge collection of them? Seems like kind of a weird thing. So the IAS, the Institute for Advanced Study, one of the first professors of humanistic studies was this gentleman, Benjamin Merritt. And Benjamin Merritt was an epigrapher and an archaeologist. And when he came to the Institute, his requirement for agreeing to join the staff was that he wanted to keep working on publishing inscriptions. And he knew that if he was going to be stuck in Princeton, New Jersey, instead of spending a lot of time in Athens, Greece, and he still wanted to publish these inscriptions, he needed a way to do so. He needed good photographs of the inscriptions, and he needed a collection of squeezes. So the Institute gave him money to go over to Greece, and he had the Epigraphic Museum make squeezes of everything in their collection. So all those stones that you saw there, made squeezes of all of those. And he also was connected with the ancient agora at Athens, which is excavated by the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, which is basically our American Archaeological Institute over in Greece. And to this day, if archaeology is something you're really interested in, you can go over to the agora and spend a summer excavating at the agora. It's a dig training school, essentially. So it's still something that you can do to this day, the same way that Ben Merritt was, 80 years ago, 90 years ago. And because of these connections to the agora, he also had their entire collection of over 7,000 fragments of inscriptions squeezed as well. So about 2/3 of our collection come from Athens and Ithaca, from the Epigraphic Museum and from the ancient agora. So what does this all mean kind of geographically? Where, in terms of Greece and the greater Mediterranean world, are these inscriptions from? So this is our broad Mediterranean world. We're going to zoom in on the kind of Greek portion of the Mediterranean. And here we can see Athens, right? So Athens and this little area around it, Attica, that's where really the heart of our collection is from. But it's not the entirety of our collection. There were also a variety of other great American, and in one case, French epigraphers who donated their collections either when they stopped working on the subject or when they passed away to the Institute, so that more of the squeezes could kind of be centralized in one place, so that if people wanted to work with them, they could work with a larger breadth of them. So that added another several geographical areas like Macedonia and Halkidiki, this little three-fingered peninsula here, as well as Asia Minor, Corinth, and also not on this map, but somewhere down to the south and east, Northern Africa and the Levant, the area that's now Israel, Syria, that region. So now we've covered a little bit about what the Krateros Project is in terms of our collection of squeezes, what squeezes are, and what inscriptions are. But what do we do in terms of digitization? Well, we digitize for three main reasons, and two of them are the same reasons that we made squeezes in the first place. So that's preservation and accessibility, right? So in the same way that making a squeeze meant that if a stone got blown up or simply someone, dropped a bowling ball on it or whatever it is, you would have some record of it. Like I said, squeezes are not invulnerable. They can be damaged by fire, they can be damaged by water, and also they do degrade over time. So they're pretty good, and I've seen squeezes that are 150 years old that are still okay, but they're not going to last forever. So if we in turn digitize those squeezes, make 2D or 3D records of those squeezes, then we'll be able to have those years and years down the road when the physical squeezes are long gone, right? And similarly to squeezes allowing people in multiple places to look at inscriptions, The downside to that is you still, if you wanted to look at squeezes in this greater area, are going to have to go to the Institute for Advanced Study or Columbia University or Harvard or Ohio State or something like that. If you're somewhere in rural Missouri, there's probably not anyone who's got a bunch of squeezes within regular distance of you. So accessibility-wise, if we get these things into image form and we get them up online, then people anywhere can have access to these. And I think that's really important because for a lot of its history, epigraphy has been relatively elitist because you needed the money to get over to Greece, you needed the money to be able to spend time there and work on these things, and it really cut down on the people who could participate in the study. And I think that hurts us really badly when we kind of cut down arbitrarily to a subset of people. So that's one of the things that we really look for and has been a guiding light in how we choose to digitize, is to make things as accessible as possible. The other big advantage to digitization that squeezes didn't necessarily present is linking up data. Right. So once you've digitized, say, an image of a squeeze and you've included good metadata, so you say, oh, this is a squeeze of an inscription from 410 BC, right? It's from Athens. It was an honorific decree for Praxiteles. It was passed by this particular secretary. Okay, you have all these pieces of information. Now you can link that image to a translation of the inscription, to a text of the inscription, to a database full of names of people and who those people are, right? So to a timeline, you could say, what's a timeline of things that happened in Greece? Well, you can link this up to that. So that ability to kind of link each of these pieces as you put them online is one of the great advantages of the internet and of digital data generally. That obviously, just because we have a bunch of squeezes sitting in a room somewhere, they're not necessarily connecting to things. Ancient Mediterranean studies, as I said, has been a big early adopter of this kind of stuff. So it's not like we're the first ones to do any of this. And when I talk about kind of our 2D and 3D workflows and where we get those from, it'll be clear that we're not pioneering these things. These are our techniques that others have used, and we're adapting them to new circumstances. So in terms of where we are in the digital landscape, this is a place where ancient Mediterranean studies is really strong. And so there's a lot of opportunity to take part in work like this. In terms of 2D, so like I said, our guiding light was accessibility. And that's the reason that we started with 2D scanning, right? Because if you look at the squeezes, which we looked at, obviously these are 3D objects. So if you're thinking about what would be the best way to digitize them, well, if you do a 2D digitization like a photograph or a scan or something, you're losing data, right? You're losing the three-dimensionality of it. So that has to be balanced with the fact that 3D files are big, right? Anybody who's messed with 3D files for gaming or anything like that knows that these are much bigger files than like a JPEG or a TIFF or something. And on top of that, they are much less usual files. So if you download a JPEG, your computer knows what to do with it. You know what to do with it. There's no confusion on that. But if you download a .obj file, your computer might know what to do with it, maybe. You might know what to do with it, maybe. But it's not nearly as common usage as a JPEG or a TIFF file. So again, if we're trying to make this available to as many people as possible, starting with 2D allows that to happen, right? So the way that we've done this, we took from Ohio State University. Ohio State also has a collection of squeezes. They had started digitizing it before we did. So we called them up and said, what are you doing? And how do you like how it works? We did that with a variety of folks. And they were the ones who we thought really had a good idea for this, for a large collection, which was this Whompin' Big scanner, which is 18.5 inches by 25 for the scanning bed. So even squeezes that are that size easily fit on there, right? We have some squeezes that are too big for it, in which case you take a bunch of pictures and then you stitch them together in Photoshop. It's not the end of the world. And one of the nice things about this scanner is it has a function called 3D lighting, which basically gives you low angle lighting, which is great because when you've got that three-dimensionality, the low angle lighting makes those 3D features pop, which helps you see what you've got on there. And for that same reason, we scan each of our squeezes twice. We scan it once with the letters face up, and then we rotate it 90 degrees and we scan it again. And the reason for that is that this 3D lighting, this raking light, is really good at making perpendicular objects show up. And it's not so good at making parallel objects show up. So if we look on the left here, this delta, super obvious, definitely a delta. That same letter on the right the lower bar is almost invisible. And the same is true if we look down at, say, this alpha, and we look at the alpha over here, crossbar, almost invisible. Vice versa, if you looked here and you weren't looking really close, you would never guess that there's an iota between that delta and that omicron. But over here, it shows up bright as day. So by doing that turn, we have a much better chance when you look at both of the photos that you're going to be able to see every feature on there, and you'll be able to tell what your letters are. So that's 2D. And we started off with 2D, but we were fortunate to get a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, which included funds to do 3D digitization. So that's one of the things that we're actually right in the middle of getting done right now. And for this, we've gone a little bit more off book than we did for the 2D. So the method that we're using is something called photogrammetry. And photogrammetry is essentially where you have an object, and it can be a relatively flat object like our squeezes, or it can be a full in the round object, something like this. And with relatively stable lighting, you take photographs from a variety of angles and positions, and then there's a computer program that takes all of those photographs and puts it all together to create a 3D object file. So what you see here is one of my team members, Maria O'Leary, who is taking those photographs of one of our squeezes with a little scale bar beneath it. And so photogrammetry been around for a long time. I'll talk about that in a second. We were kind of taught how to do this by a group called Cultural Heritage Imaging out in California, who are great at this stuff. We'll actually see one of their videos in a little bit. What we're doing is we're taking this idea and this technique and we're automating it. So we're going to build a gantry. We'll have this table. This is a side view of the table. We have the table already. And we've got this gantry, this XY gantry, which is sort of like what you would see in a 3D printer, something that can move a head around in 2 axes. And on the head of that machine, we'll have a camera and we'll have a light source, and it'll move around. This table has a 4 foot by 4 foot surface. We'll put a bunch of squeezes on it. We'll take these photographs that are necessary for photogrammetry for all of the squeezes at once, all that we can fit on there. We'll work it up together, and then we'll cut out the individual squeezes. So we get these 3D scans of the squeezes. So this is an example of a 3D scan. This is not the one that she was taking a picture of before, but I like this one because it's got a horse on it. So when you move it around, you can see the obvious advantage to doing something like this over something that's 2-dimensional, right? It captures just a lot more of that data. And so if you want to use that 3D geometry for machine learning or something like that, you have that ability with something like this. It also looks really cool, which is nice. Like I said, we're not the only ones to use photogrammetry, even in this general context. So Brown University has a collection of cuneiform tablets, right, which are another great example of 3D epigraphy because it's carved, so it's got depth to it. And they have digitized their entire collection using photogrammetry as recent as 2019. So that's a pretty current project. And if we go back a little bit further, this is a really neat concept and paper by a Spanish and Portuguese group. So basically, they took some of these models that you might make, these 3D models from inscriptions, and then they ran them through some computer algorithms to try to highlight eroded letters. Right, so a lot of the squeezes that I sent around, a lot of the ones we've seen, you can read the letters pretty obviously. The letters are in good shape. But a lot of inscriptions look more like this, where the lettering is not so easy to read. So this is one where it takes the background, kind of tries to smooth out the background, compare the in-ground pieces to the background, and then give you a really clear view of those letters. So those are the kind of things that, like I said, this is 2014. So this has been something that people have been working on for a while now. There are 2 other types of 3D digitization that are worth kind of thinking about in this context. One of them is called RTI, or reflectance transformation imaging. And this is a CHI, Cultural Heritage Imaging video. As you can see here, this stele is in Chersonesus, which is in Ukraine, or now sort of in Russia because it's on the Crimean Peninsula. So what the state of this stone is now is anybody's guess, given the tragic situation over there. But it's relatively well preserved because of this. So basically, RTI is the flip side of photogrammetry. Instead of having a camera that moves around, you have a still camera and take pictures with your flash in a lot of different places. And then you can adjust with a few different modes, not only where the light is, but how much the incised letters pop. So you can see, in some of these different modes, it makes it really easy to see where these letters are, even when there's damage in the background. And RTI is great. The problem with RTI is kind of twofold. One of the problems is a technical one, which is that it uses an assumption, a mathematical assumption about the surface of the object, which means that the 3D geometry that it generates is not accurate. It looks accurate. So for a human eye, it works great. But if you want to have a machine work on the data that's underlying it, that data is not going to be as accurate as it would be if you used photogrammetry. And that problem is true as well for shape from shading, which is the other one that I'll show you here. This is how you do RTI. That photo that I showed you earlier, we're doing RTI. We have a camera set up in a still position. I'm holding a little flash gun. So when I press a button, the flash goes, the camera takes a picture. And my colleague is holding a string out so that we are always at the same distance from the stone, right? To kind of preserve like a dome shape, which is sort of what you want for this. So one problem is that it's not exact in its geometry. The other is that the file that it creates is totally unrecognizable. You basically have to download their viewer for it. It's a free viewer, doesn't cost you anything, but your computer will have no idea what to do with these files. So again, from an accessibility standpoint, it's really not ideal. So shape from shading is a very similar end product. So you'll see here, we're moving around a light source the same way that RTI did, and we'll have a couple of modes that it'll show the same way that RTI did. The difference is in the input. So where RTI had a lot of different photos that all kind of got blended together, shape from shading just takes 2 photos. So essentially the 2 photos that we usually produce, that 2 90-degree angle light differences, that's exactly what shape from shading needs. But again, it runs into those same problems. And so we thought about kind of automatically doing shape from shading with all of our files, but ultimately decided that the amount of work that went into doing that was not rewarded by an output that was particularly useful, which is why we ended up doing photogrammetry instead. So that's digitization, now machine learning. So some of you may be familiar with machine learning, others of you less so, right? It's a really hot topic in AI and computer science and those kinds of things. But what is machine learning? Well, we've got a couple of definitions here. One is a relatively straightforward, if not super informative one. It's a field of study that gives computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed, okay? Our other definition is more exact, but much more mathy, so perhaps not as ideal. But anyway, it's a computer program. It's said to learn from an experience, E, a set of experience, with respect to some task, T, and some performance measure, P. If its performance on that task, T, as measured by the performance measure, P, improves with that experience, E. So in other words, if you show a computer program a set of data, and it can use that data to get better at doing a task, that's machine learning. So there's one main type of machine learning that's relevant for our project, which is OCR, or optical character recognition. And basically, that's a subset of computer vision, of computers seeing things, where the idea is that the computer will look at an image, say a digitized picture of one of our squeezes, and will be able to turn that image into a text file. So instead of being something that your brain can deal with, but the computer not so much, it's actually a text file that you could search, for example, and the computer can deal with that. For printed objects, right, pages like this one or this one, right? OCR is really good at this, and it's been really good at this for a long time. The post office actually uses this already. So if you use a pre-printed address, so you don't write the address on by hand, then when your letter goes through one of the postal sorting centers, they'll just run it really quick under a camera, and the computer will automatically figure out where it's supposed to go just by looking at it. But if you write your address on by hand, the computer is much less good at that because your handwriting is different from everybody else's handwriting, and it didn't have a chance to train on your handwriting, so it doesn't know what it's looking for. There are some recent improvements in this, what's called Manuscript OCR, but it's still a bit hairy. And there's been very little work done on Greek and Latin epigraphy in OCR. So that's really one of the places that we're going in the future with our project. So I'll talk a little bit about OCR, and then I'll talk about some interesting other applications of machine learning in this area. So I'm going to show you how this works. This is a print OCR engine called Tesseract. The first thing that you have to do if you're going to do OCR is you have to do what's called binarizing, which is basically make it black and white. This is already mostly black and white, so this one's an easy one to work with, and there are straightforward programs that'll just do this for you. So I can press one button and boom, now it's all the way black and white, right? And you can see why that would be easy for a computer. There's really no changes to be made. It's very straightforward. Then you run it through this engine, Tesseract, and in a relatively short space of time, and this is the table of contents for epigraphic work. In a short period of time, it'll break down regions. So here it's telling you this is a heading, these are paragraphs, right? It'll break down lines. So it's got each individual line. It'll break down words. You can see that it's broken up the words, and it's done a pretty good job of this, given that this is like random Latin and Greek going on down here. And it'll even break down by individual characters. So again, I downloaded a program called Prima that was a free 30-day trial and did all of this with like 2 presses of a button. I didn't have to do basically anything to do this. This is an example of what can be output by some of the better Manuscript OCR. So you can see, again, we've got our lines. It's identifying the lines. You can see why in cursive handwriting, it would be harder to identify individual letters, and that's one of the problems that they deal with in this. And this engine, Kraken, is used not just for this, but for some languages that are much more cursive. So Arabic, for example, is one of the main things that Kraken was designed to be able to deal with. So you can see why this would still work relatively well for the binarization. Basically black on white at the end of the day. You can also see why this would not work well for binarization. Right, we can look at this with our human eyes and brain and see letters, and it's not really a problem for us significantly to distinguish between letters and background noise. But you're not going to be able to run this through that little program and have it spit out, a black and white symbol for this. It's just not going to work. I've tried it. It's not good. So what we're trying to do is train one of these computer vision algorithms to recognize and be able to distinguish between the signal and the noise, right? We're not the only ones who are doing OCR in the epigraphy field. There's another really exciting project called Reconsidering the Roman Workshop, which is happening at the University of Exeter over in the UK. And in a lot of ways, our project and theirs are kind of helping in compatible areas. So they're interested in Latin. We're interested in Greek. Charlotte Tupman, who leads it, is particularly interested in the layout of inscriptions. So where do they put headings? Where do they fill up to the sides? How do they decide how they're going to inscribe a given object? And we're really interested in stylistic analysis of letters. So if you look at an alpha, can you place the inscription in a time period based on what shape that alpha has? And can a computer help you with that? So hopefully, by having a bunch of different projects, this is one of the great things about the digital space, is that you don't have to worry about the classic, like, I'm writing a paper, has someone else already written this? Is someone else writing this right now? You really don't have to worry about that, because for most of this stuff, it's scientific, which is to say you need to reprove the same thing many times for it to be particularly valuable. So if someone else is doing it, it's great for you to do it. You may come out with different results. And if you come out with the same results, in some ways, that's even better, right? Because then the 2 of your projects can get together and say, yes, we have a way of doing this. We know what this is going to output. Another really neat computer learning, machine learning operation is Ithaca. And you may have seen this recently because it had a big expose in Nature magazine and floated around, Facebook and Twitter and that kind of thing. And essentially, Ithaca, which is a collaboration with DeepMind, the Google machine learning group, was trying to address the problem of reconstruction of inscriptions. So as you may have noticed on the picture of me standing with big stelaes, a lot of these inscriptions are fragmentary, right? So like this one, where you've got several pieces, lots of letters, we know where they connect to each other, but there are a lot of holes. How do we fill in the holes? Historically, people who looked at so many inscriptions that their eyes bled just kind of knew what was in those gaps and took their best guesses at what was in those gaps. What Ithaca tries to do is take inscriptions where we actually have the entire thing, pretend that we don't, hide some parts of it, and train the machine, train the algorithm, how to recognize what kind of stuff is in certain gaps of certain number of letters, of certain formulae, and then it can guess at places where there are actually gaps, where we don't know what's in between. And as is the case with most of these OCR applications, the point of this is not to replace ancient historians or epigraphers or anything like that. This little table here is talking about who does best at these things. Ancient historians, a couple of different algorithms that work on this. And the actual answer for who does best at these things is when you combine an ancient historian and the algorithm, right? These are not replacements, these are tools. These are things that can help you do this kind of work. So that's what they're doing here. It's a super neat thing. You can actually work with it. You can go online and test it out and play with it. It's open. It's on GitHub. You can download the source code for it. So it's something that if you're interested in this kind of thing, you can absolutely play around with. Another thing that we can do, and this is an old poster I did years ago, is we can think again about that linked data when we think about machine learning. Because what machine learning is really great at is dealing with big data. Right? That's what it's being used for in industry. That's what it's being used for in a lot of source cases. And so if we get one of these situations where we've got many different databases and we get them to all talk to each other, right? And we can gather all that data together, we can apply machine learning algorithms to figure out groups within those. That may not be immediately obvious to us, right? We may not think that Roman funerary inscriptions from the 1st century are actually really similar to Phoenician wall inscriptions, wall graffiti from, the 6th century BC. We might not ever guess that, but computers, which come in with no preconceptions, can be very good at figuring out these connections, right? They can create interesting groupings and categories that you wouldn't have guessed otherwise. And as with the DeepMind and Ithaca example, it's spitting out these categories will do nothing on its own, right? What's going to happen is you've got to do something with it. You've got to play with it. And that you've got to play with it leads me to that last point, right? So on the cutting edge and in the classroom, what do we do with this stuff? What's the point of all this? And it is true that these tools are often being pioneered by and they're useful for senior researchers. So when you think about DeepMind and that kind of thing, yes, there are some advanced grad students and professionals working with, folks at Google and all that kind of thing. Yes, when you think about what they're going to use Ithaca for, some of it is white-haired people in Oxford trying to figure this stuff out. But the truth is, a lot of these tools are really useful for and designed for classroom use and are great for student research. So for example here, I'll use a program that we've been doing for several years with a local high school. So there's a high school near us in Princeton that actually does an ancient Greek class once every other year. And we had them come by. This is our room, although it's recently been renovated, so it doesn't look exactly like this, but you get the idea. We had them come by. We gave them a chance to look at some squeezes, work with some squeezes. And then what we did is we gave each of them an inscription that we had a squeeze of, that they could look at these digitized images of, that had never been translated into English before. And this was really useful for both learning Greek and basically doing independent research, right? So it aligns really nicely with early Greek. First thing you want to do when you're learning Greek is learn the alphabet, unless you already know the alphabet. But if you don't, it's going to be really useful to learn the alphabet, and you do that by looking at letters a bunch. The first thing you do when you're coming to face with an inscription is look at the letters and try to figure out what letters are on the inscription. So it's kind of a fun puzzle game way of getting used both to the Greek alphabet and to the inscription at the same time. Then the second thing you have to do is you have to identify words, because you may have noticed on the squeezes, or you may not, there are generally no breaks in between words on an inscription. It's just straight run-on letters. So you have to know things like the endings of words, the way that words end in Greek or in Latin. That'll help you figure out where your words are breaking. You need to know things like the articles, right? The, of, the, for, the, because that will help you figure out where the words are breaking. So again, it really helps you with your language as you're working on it, and then obviously translating. This is a translation task, and it's a translation task in this case of something that had not been translated before, which are always both the scariest, right, and most difficult translations, but also in a lot of ways the most rewarding. And I think that's one of the great things here is all these students, high schoolers, created great translations. We worked with them to workshop these translations, and then we published them on our website. Right? And this is something that any Greek class at a college, at a high school, at a local, Greek church where kids are learning Greek, any of those circumstances, you can do stuff like this. And tons of inscriptions, probably well over 3/4, if not, like 9/10 of the inscriptions in our squeeze collection, that's 30,000 squeezes, have never had an English translation. So a lot of those are short. A lot of those are easy and pithy, may have 150 letters, right? A grand total of like 30 words. And you can translate something to English and make it accessible for people who would never have access to it otherwise. And in general, with digital research, there's a lot of great opportunity for students, undergraduate students, high school students, graduate students, to do exciting research. There's technical work, so if you like computer programming, right, if that's something you're into, that's super important. But there's also a lot of non-technical work. So to do OCR, you need to take a bunch of images of inscriptions and you need to mark out and annotate what all the letters are so that the computer program can see it and get better at doing it. After it has spit out a bunch of texts, someone needs to correct the results, go through and see where there were right answers and wrong answers, right? And both of those are good ways to spend a bunch of time looking at Greek, looking at inscriptions, right? Without having to be super technically gifted. There's also a ton of open ground, and not just in terms of untranslated inscriptions, but none of these machine learning tools existed 20 years ago. Right. And a lot of these machine learning tools have only become particularly powerful in the last 10 years, 5 or 10 years, as we've had significantly more computing power available. So all of these areas where if you wanted to do research, I want to research Homer, right? I want to research the Iliad and the Odyssey. Well, if you want to do original research on the Iliad and the Odyssey in a traditional sense, you're probably going to have to read somewhere between 2 and 200 books and, 15 and 1,500 articles, because the subject has been really important and worked on for 200, 250 years. If you want to take a machine learning algorithm and apply it to the text of the Iliad, chances are not many people have done that before. You're not going to have to compete with many books that you're going to have to read and articles that you're going to have to read. You teach yourself how to do the ML stuff, which is not as hard as it sounds, and then you throw it on there, and whatever you get out is great, right? If it confirms what other people had said, awesome. If it goes against it, even better, right? So it's a really exciting place where you've got lots of room to run around, to play, to find exciting things to add to the great, discourse of ancient Mediterranean, ancient world studies. So I'll finish there by thanking you for your time and your attention, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Dr. Hershkowitz. So yes, please think of some good questions for Dr. Hershkowitz, anything you're interested in from the talk.
Makes me really, because I have problems with my ears, but I'll speak loudly enough. Can you go back to that text that had the flower on it? I just wanted to ask what it was about. It might be like a weird question, but it really interested me because like they show us the horse, but what the flower, I don't know, or it was the flower. It looked like a flower to me.
So
it was
the video of the RTI.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Here we go.
Sorry, I don't
know that. Play here. So I didn't look at what inscription was. are a funerary stele. So the top line is Xanthos, which is a fairly normal name, and I'm trying to make out the second name, but it's a person's name. Below the person's name, the word that you can see here is haire, which is hello, which is greetings. And it's fairly normal, actually, in epigraphy, in ancient inscriptions, for objects to speak. And they speak both on their own behalf. So in some ways, there's an awareness that the stone is greeting you. And in some ways, they speak on behalf of the maker or the person who's in the grave, or things like that. So this is a really simple one. And it has the two beautiful rosettes, which are definitely flowers. And then it's got the person's name and it's got a, hi. Some of them are much more involved, and they'll say things like, greetings, O passerby, you who stand there, come closer and read, for remember that we will all be here in the end. Right. And so that's obviously this conflation of, come over here and read. It's talking about literally come over here. When it says we'll all be here in the end, it's not talking about like somewhere on the side of the road in Attica. It's talking about death. Right. So it definitely is a regular thing to have this really interesting speaking relationship between inscriptions and readers. And some of that is probably because reading in the ancient world was a more out loud experience. Certainly they could read quietly, and that did happen. But there was much more of an understanding and acceptance that when you were reading something, you would do so out loud. So then you would be giving voice to this person and to this inscription as you came by and read it out. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for this. It's fascinating. I'm a very old undergrad. Oh, I'm so excited about everything. I'm just super stoked. I'm like the oldest junior at Seton Hall, and getting to do what I love. But it is probably a stupid question, and you may not have said it. I didn't catch it. Why the term squeeze? It sounds so non-academic.
Yes, it's a stupid question.
Thank you.
And I did not answer it. There is not a good reason that I know. I think the idea must be that you are squeezing the paper into the object. It is not the same word that other languages use for this. So in French, it's estampage. And in trying to think of what it is in Greek or German, because they also have estampage is, yes, like a stamping, which makes sense. That may be a better one. And it sounds more elevated. I don't know whether that's because it's French or because it's actually elevated. But certainly squeeze is not a particularly fancy term. Ektipos. Ektipos is the Greek word for squeeze. So which, person somewhere between 200 and 400 years ago decided that we were going to call this thing a squeeze? I haven't the foggiest. But it does make for an amusing situation when you try to tell people that you work with squeezes. So yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Is there?
Do you want to wait for the mic, or I don't know what your comfort with the mic is?
Is there a move to move the
Start with that.
Okay. There we go. Is there any move to move like the RTI stuff or like the 2D scans onto like on a digital sphere, but like on the internet? Like, is there any possibility you could transcribe sort of instead of having to download an application, instead just open like a web browser? Because I know there's some stuff like that for medieval texts. Because I know that they did that with the Bayeux tapestry. So I wonder if there's any sort of
that we did not do RTI and shape from shading. There is, in theory, an RTI plugin for web browsers. It was a lot of the stuff with RTI is developed by nonprofits, and they don't get a ton of money to do it. And so you get some ways along and then it stops. And so that's sort of what happened with the browser piece. And so there is one, and it sort of works. It doesn't have all the functionality that the actual RTI reader program does. And so it's one of these, like, technically it works, it's better than nothing, but it's not great. And shape from shading is pretty similar, and that whole project, which was done at the University of Florida, has kind of come to the end of its life cycle, so that's not moving forward anymore. One of the nice things about photogrammetry, by contrast, is because it works in these OBJ files, which is a really common file type. That stuff gets developed by much bigger companies and corporations, and so it keeps getting pushed forward. Our 2D materials are online. At least a small part of them are, and the reason that the others aren't has nothing to do with technical capacity and everything to do with the fact that we are trying to get our metadata schema figured out and haven't done that exactly the way we want to. But we do have an online repository, a database, and we have something like what the Bayern Tapestry has. We have a IIIF compatible viewer. And so when you click on the little things, it opens up the image itself in your browser, so you don't have to download it or cache it or anything. But we do make them available to be downloaded if you wanted the collection for whatever reason. But yeah, that's a great question, because I think that is the ideal, is to have everything be kind of openly available and as much as possible be viewable inline in the browser instead of having to download and work with it on your own PC. Thank you.
Good. So you mentioned that, like, a lot of the stuff that you take squeezes from are like funerary epitaphs. Would there be like any other kind of thing that's very common that's not like really associated with that?
Yeah, so we've got a few categories of things. The funerary happens to be a particularly big one in terms of number of inscriptions, not necessarily in terms of amount of words, because like I said, a lot of them are small. We have a lot of inscriptions that are honorific decrees. So the city of Athens in particular was big about doing this, especially in the 4th century BC, where someone would do something good for the city. Some foreigner from the Halkidiki, let's say, would do something big for the city. So the city would issue a decree that says, you know, because of the many good deeds that this person has done, and they interceded on our behalf with such and such a king, and they paid for grain at a time when there was a food shortage. Because of these things, this person is to be an Athenian citizen and their descendants and so on and so forth, and they go through the whole thing. So there are a lot of those that we have. We have a few alliances and treaties, so interstate relationships. We have a variety of those. There are a lot of lists of people. So not surprisingly, people like to see their names on stuff. So when you were the kind of equivalent of college at Athens was something called the Ephebeia, which was the process by which you became a full adult citizen. And when you finished this Ephebeia, this training period, a lot of the classes would then commemorate the person who had been their teacher with an inscription that has the teacher's name, sometimes a thing that talks about how great their teacher was, followed by all of their names. When people were on particular boards, so say you were on, you know, the faculty senate or something like that, or you were on your town's committee on some kind of, you know, dealing with parking. Well, when you got to the end of your year, you want everyone to remember this great thing that you had done for the city. So you'd make this inscription that had all of your names on it. So that's just a few of the things, but there's a lot of different stuff that gets carried out under the rubric of inscriptions and then squeezed. Yeah.
Awesome. So earlier you mentioned this summer program in Athens to kind of like work on archaeology and maybe at a dig. And I was wondering if you had any more information on that and if there were any scholarships.
Yes, I believe that there are scholarships. Charles, did you do the Agora dig or no?
No, I did Corinth.
You did Corinth, okay, because you're on the regular membership. So the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, ASCSA, that's what you want to Google. And they have a website, and on their website, one of the pieces is the summer archaeological school. I don't remember what exactly they call it, but it's the Agora Dig program. And I believe there are some scholarships available. I don't remember what the conditions for those are, but that would be something you could take a look at. And it might be something as well that you could talk to Seton Hall and the study abroad office here about whether that could be something that they could interface with. Because sometimes, schools are happy to do something if people are asking them to do it. And if it goes for a couple of years and no one asks, then they kind of drop the ball because no one's doing anything. But yes, there should hopefully be some opportunities that way.
All right. Thank you. I guess I have one quick question then before we go. You mentioned lead curse tablets. Do you have any squeezes of those?
No, I don't think we have any squeezes of metal objects. We found relatively recently, we have some plaster casts of pinakes. So pinakes are basically, in ancient Athens, they had jury duty, much the same way that we have jury duty now. The difference was that in ancient Athens, you wanted to be on jury duty because it paid relatively well. And so when it paid relatively well, and there wasn't the same situation as there is nowadays where it's like you have a job and if you don't show up to the job for a couple of weeks, people get angry. That wasn't really the way things worked in antiquity. And so you could end up in a spot where, especially if you were older or infirm, it's very difficult to get money to support yourself. And jury service could be something that did that. So a lot of people wanted to be on juries. So rather than choosing people and hauling them in and saying you don't have any choice, there was a lottery to choose who was going to get to be on jury duty. And to do that lottery, they had a big stone, which had a lot of holes in it, and you put your name tag, you got like a bronze name tag, you put your name tag into a row, and then they dropped down marbles, colored marbles, into a little slot. And if the marble was white, then that row was called, and if it was black, then it was not called. And so you would put your little pinake in there, and then you'd wait to see whether your number got called, whether you got to be part of the jury pool. And we have plaster casts, actually, of several of those surviving name tags. So we have something that's metal. Unfortunately, we don't have a curse tablet.
All right. Well, please join me in giving a round of applause to Dr. Hershkowitz. Thank you. It was a great honor that you could speak with us. I also want to acknowledge here we have the chair of our department, Languages, Literacy, Cultures, Dr. Diana Alvarez-Amel. So thank you for joining us. And Tiffany Burns from the Dean's Office of the Library. Yes. And thank you again to all of you for attending. And we'll see you in the various classes.